You have been lied to your entire life about how wealth actually works. Not in a conspiratorial way, not through some shadowy agenda, but through something far more dangerous, through the slow, quiet transmission of ideas that were never designed for you in the first place. The financial advice you grew up hearing, save aggressively, live below your means, hustle harder, invest in index funds, avoid debt at all costs, was designed for a specific kind of person. A person building a comfortable life, a person looking to retire at 65 with enough to coast. That advice is not wrong, but it is incomplete, dangerously incomplete, because there exists an entirely different category of financial thinking that never gets discussed in mainstream finance content. A set of principles so counterintuitive, so invisible to ordinary eyes, that most people spend their entire lives unknowingly violating every single one of them. These are the rules of old money, and once you understand them, truly understand them, not just intellectually but at the level of instinct and decision-making, you will never be able to look at wealth the same way again. There are 3 things this is going to reveal that will likely contradict what you currently believe. The first is about what old money families actually protect, and it is not what you think. The second is about a specific psychological pattern that separates the families who hold wealth across generations from the families who lose it within one. And the third, the one that is going to hit hardest, is about the single financial behavior that virtually every middle-class person practices that is, by design, a slow drain, a quiet leak. One that old money lineages identified centuries ago and eliminated entirely. Stay with this, because by the end, the financial world you thought you understood is going to look completely different. Let us start where the confusion begins. When most people think about old money, they think about inherited wealth, trust funds, family estates, ancestral homes with long driveways and portrait paintings on the walls. They think about aristocrats and dynasties, about people who got rich a long time ago and simply stayed rich because they had a head start. And on the surface, that narrative is not entirely false, but it is catastrophically shallow, because the idea that old money families stay wealthy simply because they have more of it is one of the most statistically demolished myths in all of economic history. Here is what the data actually shows. Researchers at the National Bureau of Economic Research studying intergenerational wealth patterns found that roughly 70% of wealthy families lose their wealth by the second generation. 70%. And by the third generation, that number climbs to 90%. 90. Out of every 100 wealthy families in America, 90 of them will have no meaningful wealth left by the time the grandchildren reach adulthood. Let that sit for a moment. This is not a modern phenomenon. It is not caused by taxes or inflation or economic shifts, though those are all contributing factors. This pattern was documented as far back as the 17th century. There is a Chinese proverb, rice paddy to rice paddy in 3 generations. There is a Scottish saying, the father buys, the son builds, the grandchild sells, and his son begs. In Japan, kimono to kimono in 3 generations. Every major civilization in recorded history independently observed the same 3-generation wealth collapse. The same pattern across cultures, across centuries, across wildly different economic systems. So the question that should be burning in your mind right now is this. What do the families that beat that statistic know that the others do not? Because they exist, the old money families that do not collapse. The lineages that have maintained meaningful compounding wealth across 4, 5, 6, even 10 generations. What are they doing differently? What do they understand that the 90% never figure out? The answer begins somewhere most. People would never look. It begins not in investment strategy, not in tax planning, not in asset allocation. It begins in the psychology of abundance versus the psychology of wealth. And these 2 things are not the same. In fact, they are almost opposites. Here is the distinction. The psychology of abundance is what most people who become newly rich operate from. It is the feeling that having money means you can now spend it, display it, enjoy it. It is the belief that wealth is something you have accumulated and can therefore use. Abundance psychology is consumer-oriented. It asks constantly, what can this money get me? It treats net worth as a score to be celebrated and a resource to be deployed. And it feels completely rational. After all, if you have worked hard and built financial success, why would you not enjoy it? But old money families, the ones who survive, operate from an entirely different psychological framework. Not the psychology of abundance, the psychology of stewardship. Stewardship psychology treats wealth not as something you have, but as something you are responsible for. The money does not belong to you. It belongs to the lineage. You are a temporary custodian. Your job is not to grow your personal lifestyle. Your job is to grow the pile and hand it, larger, to the next person in line. This is a fundamentally different relationship with money than almost anything taught in mainstream financial culture. Think about what this means practically. A person operating from abundance psychology who inherits $2 million thinks, this is mine. What do I do with it? Maybe they invest some. Maybe they buy a nicer house. Maybe they travel. Maybe they help family members. All reasonable things. But implicit in every decision is the assumption that this money is a personal resource. A person operating from stewardship psychology who inherits $2 million thinks, I am holding this for the family. My job is to return more than I received. Every expenditure is evaluated not against desire but against the question, does this grow the pile or shrink it? These two frameworks produce radically different financial behaviors over decades. Radically different outcomes over generations. But here is where it gets even more interesting. Because stewardship psychology alone does not explain the full picture. It is necessary, but not sufficient. The families that maintain wealth across generations also encode their financial philosophy differently than most people do. Most financial education is transactional. It teaches you what to do. Buy this. Invest in that. Avoid this type of debt. The teaching is behavioral. Old money families understood something fundamentally more powerful. They understood that you do not teach behavior. You teach values, you teach identity. And once a person's identity is constructed around the stewardship of wealth, their behavior follows naturally, without constant instruction. This is the second principle, and it connects directly to one of the most overlooked levers in all of personal finance. The concept of financial identity. Ask the average person to describe themselves financially, and they will give you a status or a situation. I am middle class, I am doing okay, I am trying to save more. Ask someone from an old money family the same question, and the answer is structurally different. It is identity-based. We are a family that builds. We do not sell assets. We do not touch principle. We create. We do not consume. This might sound like philosophical nuance. It is not. It is mechanistically important. Because identity-based financial behavior is vastly more durable than rule-based financial behavior. Rules can be broken when circumstances feel exceptional. Exceptions become habits. Habits become patterns. And patterns become the story of why the money disappeared. Identity is different. When you break an identity-based financial principle, you are not just violating a rule. You are betraying who you believe you are. That psychological resistance is orders of magnitude stronger than any external guideline. Old money families have been encoding financial identity into children for generations. Not through lectures, through structure, language, exposure, and expectation. The child who grows up hearing we do not sell the land. We only add to it does not need to be told not to sell the land when an offer comes in. The resistance is in the identity. This changes everything about how you think about building wealth in your own life. But this is where everything changes. If you have been finding this valuable, and the most important part is still ahead, drop a comment below right now with the word legacy. It takes 3 seconds, and it tells us you want more content like this. Now, let us talk about the specific financial behavior that old money lineages identified as the most destructive force for middle-class wealth, because this is the insight that will be hardest to hear, and the most important one in this entire video. It is called lifestyle inflation. And I do not mean that in the simple way you have probably heard it before. The idea that you spend more when you earn more. That is the surface definition. The real mechanism is far more insidious than that. Here is how lifestyle inflation actually works at the psychological level. Human beings have an extraordinary capacity for adaptation. We adjust to new circumstances with remarkable speed. A raise that felt like a windfall in month 1 feels like a baseline in month 4. A nicer apartment that felt like a luxury in the first year feels like a minimum standard by the 3rd. This is called hedonic adaptation, and it is one of the most well-documented phenomena in all of behavioral psychology. We adapt to positive changes in our circumstances at roughly the same rate as negative ones. The emotional signal disappears. The financial cost remains. This creates a specific trap for people building wealth through earned income. Every time income increases, lifestyle catches up, not maliciously, not even consciously in most cases. It just happens. The new income level creates new baseline expectations. New baseline expectations create new spending floors. And the gap between income and expenditure, the gap that creates actual wealth, either stays the same or, in most cases, narrows. Old money families figured this out. They did not talk about it in terms of hedonic adaptation. They did not have the neuroscience. But they observed the pattern empirically across generations, and they built structural defenses against it. The primary defense was this. They separated lifestyle accounts from wealth accounts completely. Not just conceptually, structurally. The money that ran the household had nothing to do with the money that built the family assets. Income flowed in. A fixed allocation went to lifestyle. Everything else flowed immediately into productive capital. Land, business stakes, debt instruments, eventually equities. The lifestyle allocation was not subject to growth. The wealth allocation was not subject to lifestyle needs. This sounds simple. It is not practiced by almost anyone outside of these circles because the temptation is always there. Income goes up. The lifestyle allocation feels artificially low. There is always a reasonable justification for expanding it. The children need better schooling. The neighborhood is safer over there. The car is more reliable. Every justification is individually reasonable. But collectively, every justified lifestyle expansion is a direct reduction in the wealth-building allocation. And that reduction, compounded over 30 years, is the difference between generational wealth and a comfortable but terminal financial position. Here is the number that makes this visceral. If a household earning $150,000 per year maintains a lifestyle cost of $80,000 and directs the remaining $70,000 into appreciating assets from age 30 to age 60, and those assets grow at an average of 8% annually, the portfolio value at 60 is approximately $8 million. If the same household, with every subsequent raise, expands lifestyle spending so that the gap between income and expenditure stays flat at $30,000 per year, the portfolio value at 60 is approximately $3.4 million. Same income trajectory, same investment returns. A difference of $4.6 million, simply from whether lifestyle inflation was allowed to close the gap. Old money families looked at that math. Again, not with modern portfolio theory, but with the intuition of watching it play out across generations, and they built identity-level resistance to lifestyle expansion. It was not about deprivation. Many of these families lived extraordinarily well, but their lifestyle was an allocation, a fixed, deliberate number, not a function of what income allowed. This is the third principle, and it is connected to something even deeper. Because lifestyle inflation is actually downstream of a belief. A belief so common in mainstream financial culture that almost nobody questions it. The belief that your financial situation should feel good. Think about what that belief produces behaviorally. If your financial situation should feel good, then discomfort. The discomfort of not spending what you could afford. The discomfort of watching peers acquire things you have chosen not to. The discomfort of delayed gratification in a culture of immediate consumption becomes a signal that something is wrong. That you are doing it incorrectly. That you need to rebalance toward enjoyment. But old money philosophy holds the exact opposite belief. Financial discomfort is not a signal that something is wrong. It is a signal that capital is accumulating. The discomfort of restraint is the sensation of wealth building. You are supposed to feel the gap between what you could spend and what you choose to spend. That gap is the mechanism. The discomfort is not a warning. It is the feeling of the machine working. This reframe, simple as it sounds, changes the entire emotional landscape of wealth building. Now let us go deeper, because there are layers here that most people never reach. One of the most misunderstood old money principles is their relationship to debt. Popular financial culture has a deeply conflicted relationship with debt. On one side, you have the debt-free absolutists, the voices that tell you all debt is slavery, that credit cards are dangerous, that mortgages should be paid off as fast as possible. On the other side, you have the leverage maximalists, the voices that tell you debt is a tool, that borrowing at 4% to earn 8% is simply rational arbitrage, that fear of debt is a poverty mindset. Old money philosophy is neither of these. It is something more nuanced and more powerful. Old money distinguishes between 3 categories of debt. Not 2, not good debt and bad debt. 3. The first category is consumptive debt. Debt taken to finance lifestyle. Consumer. Goods, vacations, experiences, depreciating assets. This category is avoided with near-religious discipline, not because debt is inherently immoral, but because consumptive debt creates a double loss. You pay the cost of the purchase plus interest, while the asset simultaneously loses value. It is the financial equivalent of digging a hole and filling it with water. Every dollar of consumptive debt taken represents a permanent reduction in the wealth-building allocation. Old money families treat this category not as temptation to be resisted, but as a category of transaction that simply does not exist in their financial universe. The second category is productive debt. Debt taken to finance an asset that generates income exceeding the cost of capital. Business loans, real estate acquisition where rental yield exceeds debt service, margin used to acquire cash-flowing positions. Old money families are not afraid of this category. They are skilled in it. Because they understand that used correctly, productive debt is simply the renting of someone else's capital to accelerate the growth of your own. The key metric is not the size of the debt, it is the spread between return and cost. Positive, spread, well-structured, is capital creation. They have been doing this for centuries. The third category is strategic debt. This is the least understood and perhaps the most powerful. Strategic debt is debt taken not because you need it, but because the structure it creates is financially optimal, often for tax purposes, estate planning, or liquidity management. The ultra-wealthy borrow against appreciated assets rather than selling them, avoiding capital gains realization while maintaining investment positions and accessing liquidity. They use debt as a structural tool in estate architecture. They use it to maintain optionality without liquidating productive holdings. The financial press occasionally reports on this. The famous observation that several of the world's wealthiest individuals pay relatively low tax rates because they do not sell assets, they borrow against them. What the press frames as a loophole or a moral controversy, old money families understand as basic structural finance. You do not realize gains until strategically optimal to do so. You use debt to access value without triggering taxable events. The asset continues compounding. The interest is often deductible. The capital tax clock is paused. This is not available to most people practically, because it requires significant asset bases to make the structure work. But the underlying principle that the relationship between debt, taxation, and asset growth is a system to be optimized, not a moral binary, is available to anyone willing to think at this level. Let us talk now about the one old money, insight that is perhaps the most actionable, the most immediately translatable to your own financial life, regardless of where you currently are. And it is also the one most completely absent from mainstream financial education. The concept of the asset base floor. Every old money family, at some point in its history, established what could be called a floor, a base level of productive assets below which the family would never, under any circumstances, fall. Not by explicit rule necessarily, but by deep cultural understanding. The principle is sacred. You live on returns. You never eat the principal. This sounds simple. In practice, it is extraordinarily difficult to maintain during difficult periods. Economic downturns, family crises, business failures, medical emergencies, life is full of moments that create pressure to access the base. Old money families that survived across generations had structures and cultural commitments in place that made accessing principal extraordinarily difficult. Trusts with specific distribution rules. Family councils with voting requirements. Legal structures that required multi-party consent before principal could be liquidated. They built the fortress walls before the siege. They structured the protection into the architecture so that even under maximum psychological pressure, the base could not easily be touched. Most people build wealth without ever establishing a floor. They have a number. They want to reach 1 million, or 2 million, or 5 million. But that number is a goal, not a floor. Goals can be borrowed against, spent, partially liquidated for good reasons. A floor is different. A floor is a structural commitment that the asset base will not go below a certain point, regardless of circumstance. Everything above the floor is available for strategic use. The floor itself is permanent. This single distinction, wealth as a goal versus wealth as a structural floor, explains a significant portion of the difference in financial outcomes across generations. Because when wealth is a goal, reaching, the goal creates a psychological shift. You have arrived. Now what? Maintenance feels like stagnation. The emotional momentum that drove accumulation dissipates. Lifestyle catches up. And gradually, quietly, the goal starts shrinking. When wealth is a floor, there is no arrival. There is only the floor and everything above it. The floor creates permanent psychological urgency, not anxiety, but direction. There is always more above the floor to build. The floor only ever moves up, never down. This is a fundamentally different relationship with wealth accumulation, and it produces fundamentally different long-term trajectories. Now we arrive at the piece that ties everything together. The insight that closes every loop opened at the beginning of this video. Remember the question posed early on. Why do 90% of wealthy families lose their wealth by the third generation? We talked about psychology. We talked about identity. We talked about lifestyle inflation and debt philosophy and the asset base floor. All of these are correct. All of these are important, but they are symptoms of a deeper cause. The deepest cause is this. Most families treat wealth as a destination. Old money families treat it as a direction. Destination thinking says, we are trying to get somewhere. Once we get there, we have succeeded. The goal is a state to be reached, not a practice to be maintained. Destination thinking produces burst effort, arrival euphoria, and eventual drift. It produces the first generation who builds, the second generation who maintains, and the third generation who spends. Because the third generation was never given a direction, they were given a destination that had already been reached. Direction thinking says, we are always moving. There is no arrival. The practice of building, protecting, and growing is not the means to an end. It is the identity itself. Old money families that survive pass on not a pile of assets, but a directional philosophy. We are builders. We move toward accumulation. Always. Not because we need more, but because building is who we are. This is the inheritance that no government can tax, no market crash can eliminate, no generation can spend, because it lives in identity, not in accounts. And this is what makes old money rules so profoundly different from ordinary financial advice. Ordinary financial advice is trying to get you somewhere. Old money philosophy is trying to make you someone. The difference between those two things is the difference between reading about swimming and knowing how to swim. One is information, the other is transformation. You have now heard the principles that most people will go their entire lives without understanding. The stewardship psychology versus abundance psychology. The role of financial identity over financial rules. The mechanism of lifestyle inflation and the structural defenses against it. The three categories of debt and how they are used as tools. The concept of the asset base floor. And finally, the distinction between destination wealth and directional wealth. What you do with this is entirely yours to determine. But here is the one thing worth carrying out of this video above all else. Wealth is not a number you reach. It is a practice you embody. And the moment you stop practicing it, the moment you treat the pile as a destination rather than a direction, is the moment the three-generation clock starts ticking. The families that beat the statistics are not smarter than you. They are not luckier than you. They simply learned to think about money differently. And once you have heard these ideas, truly heard them, you cannot unhear them. That is the gift and the weight of understanding old money rules. The question now is whether you will use them. If this changed how you see wealth, do two things right now. First, subscribe to FinTrove, because this is the kind of content we build here. And if you leave without subscribing, the algorithm will almost certainly not bring you back. Second, watch the next video in this series. It covers exactly how ordinary people starting from zero can begin encoding these old money principles into their own financial architecture. Without a trust fund, without inherited capital, and without waiting for a lucky break. The direction starts now.